So one thing that's really important anytime, but especially in the wintertime, is that my van starts. And I think I've been having a hard time getting my van started in the cold because the ECU, or the engine control unit, is not keeping the glow plugs lit for long enough. I realize now that this is kind of a wild hunch, but the capacitors on the ECU are known to go bad over time, and if nothing else, replacing the capacitors on the ECU is good preventative maintenance. So I ordered some replacement capacitors. I got 2 sets of everything, just in case something went wrong and I needed a spare, and with shipping it was $20. So I went into this project feeling pretty confident and feeling pretty good about myself for saving the money, as some people like to charge up to $400 for doing this work. Immediately though, I ran into problems. I used 99% isopropyl alcohol to clean the PCB after I removed a capacitor, which is just a stupid mistake. 99% is too strong and will cause the PCB to start to dissolve and get kind of gummy. Thankfully, I realized my mistake, and hopefully I haven't damaged the PCB long term. But with my confidence shaken and realizing that I'm sort of working on a one-of-a-kind part here, or at least a part that's very difficult to source, I felt kind of shaky, and yeah, I was just kind of randomly stabbing the circuit board with the soldering iron, not being as careful as I should have been. But the only issue that I saw was underneath this capacitor, there is just a little blue piece of fuzz. I don't even know if this is from the capacitor, but it's weird that it was in there, and so we cleaned that up, and I replaced all the electrolytic capacitors on the board. And thankfully after this was all done, I got the ECU installed, and the van started right up. I don't think it's affected the function of the glow plug relay at all, which is kind of disappointing, and the van is running the same, which is both good and a little bit disappointing. It's time to fix the broken headlight. The hardest part about this process was breaking half of the clips that hold the grille on, but after I did that, it was pretty smooth sailing. What's funny is that this is the same process for changing a headlight bulb. You actually have to remove the whole headlight assembly to get to the bulb. I got everything back together, and I gotta say, there's nothing like getting everything back together and realizing you forgot to plug it in. But at this point I was well practiced, so it probably took me about 5 minutes to take everything apart and put it back together again. Ever since I got this van, all of the door seals have barely been hanging on. I learned recently that you can replace the clips that hold them in place, and this will often help things seal up a little better. The first clip that I replaced, I ripped the rubber on the door seal, but it still held a lot better than it was before, so I consider that a success. And then I replaced a bunch of clips on both of the front door seals, and it seems like the van is a lot less drafty now. I noticed my van rattles a lot when I go down bumpy roads, and I traced the rattle down to the left side of the front bumper. One of the clips that holds the bumper on was broken, so I just glued it in place, and that seems to have fixed the rattle. When I started filming this day, I plugged my microphone into the wrong jack on my camera. And unfortunately, I was filming my diesel heater video at the same time, so this affected a lot of footage. But anyways, I decided to finally install the high output alternator that I bought over a year ago. And of course, even though the alternator was supposed to be a direct swap, not only was the new alternator physically larger, which I guess makes sense, but the terminals were in different locations. This of course wasn't really a big deal because I was planning on upgrading the factory wiring anyways, so I just had to make the new wires a little bit longer. I've never seen a setup like this where 2 wires are going into one crimp, especially on an OEM wiring harness, but that's how this was set up. So I made some cables. I decided to double up on the 4-gauge wire. I'm not really sure if this was necessary, but I decided it's better to be safe than sorry. But when I went to fit the alternator, I couldn't get the belt onto the pulley, and that's because this alternator was interfering with an unused screw hole on a coolant pipe. So I had to do some clearancing with an angle grinder. I don't like using angle grinders just in general. I don't know why, they just kind of freak me out, and then doing it in such an enclosed space was extra scary. Especially considering that if I didn't do this right, I was going to poke a hole in a coolant pipe. But it all worked out, and we got the clearance that we needed after a couple of cuts to mount the alternator. The next step was to upgrade the wiring. I first upgraded this wire from the cylinder head to the chassis. Because the alternator mounts to the block, I don't think I really needed to upgrade this wire, but I figured while I was in here I might as well. And then I added another positive wire between the MIDI fuse that I added and the battery. The factory wire goes into the front of the engine bay here and somehow pops out by the battery, but I had no access to that wiring and I can't even see how it's routed to get there. So I don't exactly love how I have this set up. Having the MIDI fuse just floating here isn't ideal, but This is the hard line for the AC compressor, and then we've got coolant line here. And I don't want the cables rubbing up on either of those things, so I'm kind of tried to position it here, and yeah, I kind of had to do an awkward doubling back here with the factory wire. So I think this will be all right. I have to keep in mind that the motor moves, so there needs to be some flexibility here. The next step is to upgrade the wire between the battery and the chassis ground. Fortunately, I happened to find a threaded hole in the frame, which was right next to the factory chassis ground. So I just added another cable going through the bottom of the battery box to this location. And you'll notice at the same time, I added another cable between the chassis and the motor. There's now quite a lot going on in the battery box, but the cables are tied up and as isolated and protected as I think they can be. The upgraded alternator does work, but it also makes some crazy noises, and I'm really not sure what this is. I'm guessing it's some sort of voltage transformer whine, but it sounds pretty crazy to me. While I had everything apart for the alternator upgrade, I decided to just take a peek under the timing cover, and boy am I glad that I did. The previous owner did replace the timing belt right before I got the van because it was suspected that it was original, but I guess when he did the job he just didn't bother or didn't know to inspect the timing belt tensioner, which has clearly gone bad. There's quite an alarming amount of rubber underneath the timing cover here, so I consider myself really lucky that the timing didn't skip at all while this was going on. So I decided to replace everything. I got a new timing belt tensioner, and pulley. It still seems like the timing belt flaps around a lot, but the new tensioner is definitely good, so I guess this is normal. I also noticed that this tensioner pulley was making quite a lot of noise, so I replaced it and I replaced all the drive belts. I also threw some paint on that cross member that I dented while I was in Nevada. 1 year ago, I filled the transmission mount on the left with urethane. Pretty much immediately, the urethane tore, and there's been somewhat of a vibration in the cab since I did this so-called repair. Unfortunately, the part on the left is no longer in production, but you can still get this part for vans with an automatic transmission, which is what is on the right. And apparently, the bushing in the middle can be pressed out. I don't even own a press, so I decided to take this job to a mechanic. Surprisingly, the mechanic charged me for a full hour of labor for this job. I guess the struggle is evident here. He said it was really hard to swap these parts over, but I appreciate that they were able to get it done. If you've been following my channel, you saw me replace one of the U-joints in this drive shaft out in the desert. Because I wasn't able to use a Toyota part and I noticed that the other U-joint was going bad, I decided to pull the drive shaft again and completely rebuild it. I was hoping that this would just be a quick time lapse and voiceover, but unfortunately, the drive shaft really fought me when I did this. I would press the spider bearing to one side to remove the bearing cap, but when I tried to press the bearing back the other direction, it kept jamming sideways. And I wound up having to completely cut out both of the U-joints, which was really frustrating. Then, after some very tedious filing and sanding to try to remove the grooves caused by the bearing caps, I pressed everything back together, and boy did it fight me. I probably should have taken it back apart at this point and done some more work on the bearing surfaces, but at this point I was just so done. I thankfully got it back together, and it seems like the joint is loose enough. It took a lot more hammering than I think it should have, but hopefully it's okay. Last spring when I was in Utah, pack rats built a nest right on top of my motor. Apparently, pack rats like really dark, confined spaces, and because of that, it's really common to find a pack rat nest in your engine bay. Thankfully, they didn't chew through any wiring or anything crucial, they just tore up a bunch of foam that was in the engine bay. But after this, I was pretty paranoid. Anytime I was in the desert, I would crack the hood and set up a light shining on top of the engine. Of course, the problem with leaving the engine cover open all the time is that this provides a clear pathway for other rodents and insects to get inside of my van. So I had this waterproof LED light strip laying around, and I decided to stick a few segments of the light strip to some polycarbonate and wire up a few strip lights in and around the engine bay. When overnight temperatures drop below 20 degrees, I find that my batteries don't charge in the morning. I have my solar charge controller set up to not charge the batteries if their temperature is above 5 degrees Celsius, and if you try to charge the lithium batteries below freezing, you can damage them. So since I'm planning on doing a little bit more traveling in the mountains this winter, I wanted to have a reliable method of heating my batteries so that I can keep them charged. I think it was Will Pros that mentioned these holding tank heaters are a good option. So I just bought some of the cheapest holding tank heaters I could find on Amazon, and the first thing I like to do before I install anything in my van is to try to understand how it works, and boy did these confuse me. The specifications on these heating pads say that it has to be below 37 degrees for the heating pad to turn on. So I was surprised to find that on a warmer day, I plugged these pads in and they started heating up right away. Again, according to the specification, the heating pad is supposed to turn off at 50 degrees, implying that if it's more than 50 degrees outside, you won't be using any power. I wasn't really sure where the thermostat was on these pads, so I just tried to heat them up as quickly as I could with a heating gun to try to get them to turn off. Eventually, after they were quite warm and seemingly still getting hotter, I decided to remove the adhesive backing to look for the thermometer, and lo and behold, I found it. This thermostat is rated to switch at 70 degrees Celsius or 158 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just totally different from the specification. But I figured with the thermostat so close to the heating coil, it would probably be about right for keeping my batteries warm. Though the next day, I woke up and I realized that 158 degrees is way too hot. That means no matter the weather, when I turn on these heating pads, they're going to start using a lot of power. So I bought some aftermarket temperature controllers to try to dial it back a little bit. I then, of course, had to wire up both the rat lights and the battery heaters, which was actually a good opportunity to blow the dust out of the electronics area. I then took my van to the tire shop because one of my tires has had a slow leak for a few months now. They took a look at it, and of course the tread is split right in the middle. It's not just a puncture, but a tear of the tread. So obviously the tire shop refused to mount the tire back on the wheel, and I had to leave on my spare tire. Because my van is all-wheel drive, this means I have to get 4 brand new tires. But before I do that, I wanted to see if I could get the wheel that I bent in Alaska fixed. I took both bent wheels off of the van, hauled them over to a wheel shop, and they told me the wheels were fine. They said that there was no bend that they could even detect. So I really don't know what was happening or what was going on at that tire shop. They did charge me for a remounting fee, which apparently wasn't necessary at all. But I got the new tires and I put the suspected bent wheel on the steer axle, and I haven't felt any vibration at all from the tires. And I think it's a good thing that I got new tires. These tires have a higher load index. They're rated for snow, and they have these side biters, which I initially thought didn't do anything, but it turns out they protect the tire when you're aired down, and I think my puncture was caused because I wasn't aired down and I hit a sharp rock. It was time for some fuel system maintenance. Some of the rubber lines that were feeding my diesel heater had cracked, and then I think some of the other rubber fuel hoses on my van are original to the van, as they looked to be in pretty poor condition. So I replaced, I think, all of the rubber fuel lines. My fuel filter was way overdue for replacement, and there's a way of pulling this thing out and replacing it without spilling diesel everywhere. Last time I did it without spilling hardly at all, but this time I just made a total mess. Last year I replaced all of my gear oil and everything looked great except for the front differential, and that came out black with lots of metal. So I figured since it's been a year, I should at the very least drain and fill the differential and see how it's looking. Fortunately, when I pulled the drain plug, the oil came out looking practically brand new, and there was a little bit of metal on the drain plug magnet, but in general I think it's good. I think whoever maintained the van last just didn't change the front differential oil for whatever reason. Would you believe that I'm taking apart my vent fan again? This motor's squeaking. Amazingly, Airxcel sent me another one for free. I think this is the 4th motor they've sent me. But before I replace this one, I'm going to try something. I read somewhere online that loosening the screws on the top of the motor fixes the squeaking. So what I did is I loosened the screws all the way, filled the screw holes with Loctite, and literally only finger tightened the screws. And amazingly, it worked. At least at first. It's amazing how much mud is still caked underneath my van from the Dempster Highway. While I was doing this work, I removed as much mud as I could, but there's still actually quite a lot under there. The crazy thing about this Dempster mud is that it doesn't wash off. Even with a direct spray from a pressure washer, it doesn't budge, and it has to be scraped off instead. I went to do an oil change and I found a bunch of green corrosion on my Fumoto valve. I use this valve so I can do oil changes without spilling any oil while I'm out in the field, but also the drain plug threads on my oil pan are stripped out.
Jeez, who put that on last? So this is a full synthetic diesel oil. It's 5W40, which is actually a relatively new invention. This motor takes 5W30 in the winter and 15W40 in the summer. So this oil covers both cases, which is good because I feel like the motor gets pretty hot even in the winter time. So I really do want that heavier weight oil in there, but then it's got lower viscosity when it's cold. So it'll crank faster and I should have fewer starting issues when it's cold.
I also quickly tested my glow plugs. I just had to remove the common rail on all the glow plugs and they all looked good. This sliding door contact broke a few months ago, so I decided to glue it back together. My toilet handle was loose, and I was also getting poked every time I opened my toilet drawer by these screws, so I cut them off. I also did a lot of cleaning, touch-up, and organization. It felt really good to take everything out of my van, deep clean stuff that I normally don't have access to, and reorganize everything. It's amazing. This is just a subset of all of the tools and spare parts that I carry with me, and it really takes up a lot of space in my van. But also when I got stuck in the Yukon this summer, I was really glad that I had all of this stuff. I also upgraded my backsplash to try to keep the window covering a little bit cleaner. So finally, with all of this work done, I headed for the mountains. Immediately, I ran into some issues though. My battery heaters stopped working. Initially, I thought it was because I bent them around the corner on the edge of the battery, and I noticed that if I kind of massaged them, they would come back to life. Also, while the van did start a little bit better, it's still starting a little rough in the cold. I think more or less this is normal. It might be starting a little harder because there's an issue with my injector pump, but because it's a pretty involved process to rebuild the injector pump, and by and large the van is running okay, I'm not gonna worry about it right now. I also noticed that my newly rebuilt drive shaft was making some noise, so I decided to go back home and regroup. I took the drive shaft into a professional and he said that it looks good, it was just really out of balance. So I think by forcing it back together the way I did, I might have just affected the geometry of the driveline, and hopefully a balance will have resolved everything. I bought a brand new set of holding tank heaters and they exhibited the same issue, which I eventually figured out is being caused by cold weather. So for some reason, these don't work when they are cold. So I dug the original battery heaters out of the very cold trash can and dissected them to figure out what was causing the open circuit. The issue wound up being these thermostats, which are wired in separate from the heating pad. Based on their markings, these are supposed to open the circuit above 10 degrees C. But in my testing, even when hitting them directly with a heat gun, they never opened. Instead, these open the circuit when they are below a certain temperature, roughly -5 degrees C. So I removed the useless thermostats and now my battery heaters work fine. These tank heaters cost $25 a piece, so I'm a little bummed out that I wasted $50 buying a brand new set, but I think they'll actually work pretty well now. I also installed an oil pan heater, which might not do much, but it should make the cold starts at least a little bit easier.
So apparently, if you put RV antifreeze through a water filter, you will ruin it. So that's something I learned. I flushed like 7 gallons of fresh water through this thing and it was still tasting like antifreeze, which is really gross. So we had to replace the filter, but I think that's it. I think the van is finally ready to go. This has been a lot. This has been too much. I think what happened is last year when I was getting ready to hit the road, I put some of these maintenance items off. I figured I could wait a year on a lot of this stuff and it all just kind of stacked up. And then it was also a really rough year for the van. I put a lot of miles on, a lot of hard miles going all the way up to the Arctic Ocean. And a lot of things happened that needed to be addressed. And so I do enjoy kind of the technical aspect of living in a van and working out all the little systems and stuff, but I don't like it when it just totally takes over my life for a couple of months, and that's what's just happened. So I'm really looking forward to spending some time in nature, and hopefully all of the van stuff will just kind of be working now that I've taken care of all this maintenance. And of course, there's always something that's going to be broken. There's always something that's going to need maintenance. I'm hoping it'll be a lot less intense than it has been for the last couple of months. I actually could have hit the road a couple of days ago, but I wanted to get this video edited, and that really cold weather was blowing through, and I want to go up into the mountains now and do some hiking, and I'm going to wait for the snowpack to stabilize, because along with all of this cold weather came a lot of snow, and that means, especially when I'm going to be hiking solo, it's really dangerous for me to be doing anything up in the Alpine right now. So I'm just going to wait, because if I go up there right now, I'm just going to be sitting in a cold van watching my batteries die, and then when the snowpack does stabilize, I'm going to have to leave because my batteries will be dead. So I'm trying to time this strategically. I know getting caught in that really cold weather would have been good for my channel. It would have been a good episode, probably with lots of drama, but that sounds miserable. It was so much easier to just come back to my parents' house, plug my van in, and hang out inside while all of this happened. And I know a lot of people don't have that option, but I am really thankful to have that option. So anyways, I'll see you all in the next one.